Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. And since it was mentioned that I lived as a monk for 15 years, I figured I have to explain why I lived as a monk for 15 years to get that out of the way. It's interesting because 2 years ago I moved out of the monastic order, so I'm no longer a monk. So while I was a monk, people always ask me, why did you become a monk? And now that I'm no longer a monk, people are asking me, why are you no longer a monk? So it seems like answering those questions is just a part of my karma, sort of. So before we get into mindful leadership, I want to share a little bit of my journey with you and also help you kind of understand why I came to doing what I'm doing, which is talk about mindfulness and meditation and how it can help corporations and individuals as in general. So I grew up in Southern California for the most part. My parents came over with almost next to nothing. We had set up shop on Venice Beach, very simple and humble beginnings. Within about a 7-year period, my parents established a multi-million-dollar jewelry business. I believe they worked 7 days a week. I don't know if they really took a day off. They just couldn't afford to take a day off. And so it wasn't long before we were really living the American dream. So this is the house that my dad built from ground up, actually, in 7 years from having nothing. It was a house, 6-bedroom house, pool, jacuzzi, a waterfall, and my bedroom window, which was the one on the top right, I had a postcard view of all of downtown LA. So that was there for a little bit, but in the early 90s, my parents' jewelry business caught on fire, and we literally lost everything. Yes, quite a shock. I was 21, my third year of college. My dad decides to explore other business opportunities, and he decides to go to post-communist Bulgaria in 1992, right when it had come out of communism. So my mom and I, we pack up our bags, we leave everything behind, whatever little we had, and we go off to Bulgaria. Now, we ended up going from that house to living in a 1-bedroom apartment in one of these types of buildings. Now, at that time in Bulgaria, hardly anybody spoke English. Like, you really couldn't find anybody that spoke English. Everything on TV was in Russian and in Bulgarian, so I couldn't even watch TV. All the movies were a couple years old. I guess they were pirated or whatever. They were just in the theaters. There were no basketball courts that I could find, no volleyball. This is the stuff that I grew up with in LA. There was, I think, one tennis court at the end of a town. I had to take a bus to get there, 45 minutes. Even the operator didn't speak English, so I'd have to walk to the post office and make a call to the U.S. So that was a time when I really went internal, started my own internal journey, and began the practice of meditation and mindfulness. This was about 20 years ago. Gradually, we moved back to the U.S., to the East Coast. After working in the finance field for a couple of years, I decided I needed to take a break and go on a meditation retreat to India, just to kind of clear my mind. So I ended up going to India and living as a monk for the idea was to be there for a month. I spent 6 months there, traveling around, living in a monastery with 40 other monks, waking up at 4 in the morning, meditating for 2 hours a day. I really thought I was going to freak out at this lifestyle, but somehow I fell in love with it. Right? Sleeping on the floor, doing simple services. Then I came back to the U.S., moved into a monastery in New York City, of all places, and decided to spend another 6 months as a monk, just to keep that experience going, because it was the most deeply fulfilling experience I'd ever had in my life. And it turns out that I ended up spending another 14 and a half years living in New York as a monk. So this was not part of the game plan, but I ended up spending a total of 15 years living as a monk. Last July, I decided I wanted to get married. Last July, actually, I got married. 2 years ago, I moved out of the monastery. So that's a little bit about my journey on how I came to, this is me as a monk in New York. Got to have that little cell phone there to match my robes. So one of the key things that we practiced and learned about was the nature of the mind. And this is my book, in case anyone's really interested in figuring out all the crazy things that happened in my life that led me to becoming a monk. So one of the key things I focused on, or the focus was to understand the nature of the mind. And what is the mind? Because if you think about it, most of our stress and anxiety comes from our mind. It's not so much the external situation, it's how we perceive that situation. So I'm sure we've all had an experience where you've perhaps had an argument with somebody, like somebody you don't like, and you're arguing with them, and you realize the whole argument was taking place simply in your mind. Like you were yelling at them, and then you were coming up with dialogue for them that they were yelling back at you in your mind. You guys can relate to this? Or just because I live in New York, am I the only crazy one here? Okay, so I'm hoping you've all had this experience, otherwise I'm sounding completely nuts here. The mind is really the cause of our stress and anxiety and depression. And mindfulness meditation can really help with this. So I like to compare the mind to a hard drive, which stores unlimited information. Everything we smell, taste, touch, see, or hear gets registered in the mind. But most of it we're not even aware of. According to Psychology Today, an average person has between 25,000 and 50,000 thoughts a day. That's about 1,000 to 2,000 thoughts every single hour. We're having so many thoughts, but we're not even aware of our thoughts. Like every 2 seconds, your mind goes off to something else. Right? And what is our mind doing? It's doing two things. It's either thinking about the past or it's planning the future. And what unfortunately happens is a lot of times the mind focuses on negative things from the past. Right? How many here are bothered by something that happened to them a year ago? In some ways you were hurt, but somehow you still remember it. Raise your hand if you, right? How many of you are bothered by something that happened 5 years ago? Right? You happen to just remember it, not on purpose, but it just comes up, right? 10 years ago? 20 years, right? So the mind has a hard time letting go. But a lot of those things have no relevance in our lives right now. But it comes up. If you could choose, you would choose not to remember those things. But you see, the mind is on autopilot. So the point about mindfulness is to bring it so that it's not on autopilot and that we can actually have more control over what goes on up here. And if it's not in the past, the mind is in the future. It's planning something all the time. Even while you're sitting and listening to me, you might be planning an email. Some of you might be thinking about, I wonder what the lunch menu is going to be. How many of you are thinking about lunch accidentally? If not purposely, but accidentally, yeah. So, I like to think of the mind as like our smartphone. Right? And in our smartphone, whenever you have too many apps open, it slows the phone down, right? So you close them out. So our mind has a gazillion apps open. The food app is one of those that just can't close. It's one of those things that comes with the phone. You can't even delete it if you wanted to. So that one's just kind of open. You're eating lunch, you're going to be thinking, I wonder what's going to be for dinner. And dinner, what about breakfast? So that one's always there. But the mind is always planning. And a lot of times it's planning and becoming anxious about things that may or may not happen. What if I don't make it to my meeting tomorrow? Well, if you don't make it to your meeting tomorrow, then you're not going to make it to your meeting tomorrow. Worrying about it all now and losing sleep about it now is not going to help us, right? Or for example, let's say you're stuck in traffic and you know you're not going to make that meeting. And you have two choices at that point. Either to give yourself high blood pressure because you're not going to make it, or remain calm. But that switch is in the mind. We actually have the power to turn that off. And that's what's called mindfulness training. Now, there's a lot of scientific research out there on mindfulness. According to Forbes, it makes you more productive, right? If you can clear out those apps, won't you become more focused and productive? Absolutely. According to the New York Times, it enhances creativity and memory. Right? We forget things because we're stressed. We've got so much on our mind, so much on there that we don't need at the moment. According to Psychology Today, it decreases anxiety, depression, and stress. And according to the Harvard Business Review, it actually boosts emotional intelligence, gives us the ability to understand another person's perspective. Right? And how important is that? Not at work and at home, everywhere. And these are some of the studies, in case you want to look them up, right, that have been done on mindfulness. And you can read the research papers. And just some of the benefits that we've already kind of mentioned are stress reduction, boost to working memory, and I think we can all use a little boost to our working memory. It improves our focus. Again, another way to think of the mind is like a traffic jam. When you clear the traffic, then there's movement and there's flow. Less emotional reactivity, right? We all have a tendency to sometimes react emotionally. It helps calm that down. That can be very useful in a heated meeting. More cognitive flexibility and relationship satisfaction. Right? If you're obviously able to focus more, you're able to remain more calm, you'll have better relationships, personally and professionally.